Moses had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythm of life, far from the noise of Egypt. The sands of Midian stretched endlessly before him, a landscape painted with solitude and silence. As he guided the flock across the rugged land, he often wondered if this stillness was all he was meant to experience for the rest of his days. The calm felt safe, familiar, almost like a shield against the memories he left behind in Egypt. Memories filled with conflict, fear, and a sense of not belonging. Little did he know that the calm he embraced was only the threshold of something far greater. The wind carried with it the scent of dry earth as Moses scanned the horizon, making sure none of the animals strayed too far. He had repeated this same routine for years, every sunrise blending into the next. The desert, though harsh, gave him a sense of order. Each day looked like the day before, predictable and unthreatening. Yet somewhere deep within him, there was a faint whisper, a quiet stirring that perhaps his life wasn't meant to fade into anonymity among the hills of Midian. As he walked, his mind drifted back to Egypt, the land of his upbringing, where every wall towered high and every decision was shadowed by oppression. Although he had once lived in a palace, he never truly felt like he belonged there. He had seen injustice with his own eyes, witnessed cruelty, and carried the weight of guilt for choices he made long ago. Leaving Egypt didn't erase the past, but it allowed him to step away from it. Now, the man he had become was very different from the one he once was. The heat shimmered above the rocks as Moses led the flock toward a familiar hillside. Everything around him felt ordinary, unchanged, expected. But that sense of familiarity shattered when he noticed a flicker of light dancing in the corner of his vision. At first he assumed it was the sun reflecting off a stone, but as he turned toward it, he realized it was something entirely different. A bush, alive with flames, burned brightly against the dull colors of the desert. Moses slowed his pace, his eyes fixed on the unusual sight. Fire in the desert wasn't rare, but something about this flame drew him closer. The bush crackled with energy, its branches engulfed in brilliant light, yet not a single leaf curled or blackened. The fire consumed nothing. It simply burned, steady and vibrant, as if defying the very nature of flame itself. Moses felt the air around him shift, the world becoming strangely still. Curiosity overpowered caution as he stepped nearer, each footfall sending small puffs of dust into the air. He had seen many strange things in the wilderness, but nothing like this. The flames reached upward like living beams of light, and yet the bush remained untouched. It was as if time itself paused around it. Moses felt an unexplainable pull, something deep and instinctive urging him not to turn away. As he drew closer, the silence became almost overwhelming, as though the desert itself was holding its breath. And then it happened. A voice, strong yet gentle, echoed through the air, calling his name. "Moses, Moses!" The sound reverberated not only through the space around him, but deep inside his chest, shaking him in a way he had never experienced before. He froze, his breath catching as he searched for the source of the voice. The realization that this was no ordinary moment washed over him like a wave. Moses removed his sandals, trembling as he understood the sacredness of the place where he stood. The presence he felt was unlike anything he had known. It was powerful, overwhelming, yet filled with a sense of love and purpose. The voice spoke again, identifying itself as the God of his fathers, the one who had watched over generations long before he was born. Moses lowered his head, fear and awe tightening his throat. God spoke of seeing the suffering of his people in Egypt, of hearing their cries and remembering his promises to them. And in that holy moment, Moses learned the unimaginable. He had been chosen to confront the very empire he had fled from. He was to lead the children of Israel out of bondage and into freedom. It was a calling so vast that Moses felt the ground tilt beneath him. His mind raced as he tried to reconcile the quiet life he had built with the monumental task God was placing before him. How could someone like him, a man who had hidden in exile for years, stand before a ruler as feared as Pharaoh? How could he speak for an entire nation when he barely felt capable of speaking for himself? The weight of the calling pressed against his chest, filling him with uncertainty. Moses attempted to voice his doubt, but the words wavered. He questioned why he had been chosen and confessed his fear of failing. The idea of returning to Egypt stirred old wounds, old memories he wished had remained buried. But God, with patience that exceeded human understanding, assured him that he would not face this mission alone. The one who called him would walk with him through every step. Despite the reassurance, Moses still struggled with the idea. He felt small, ordinary, unqualified, a shepherd with a past he didn't want to face. But God's voice was unwavering, steady like the flames that refused to die out. God shifted Moses' attention to something simple, something he carried every day, a shepherd's staff. It was ordinary, unimpressive, worn by years of use. When God instructed him to cast the staff onto the ground, Moses obeyed. His heart pounded as he watched the staff transform, twisting and coiling into a living serpent. Instinctively he stumbled back, startled by the miracle unfolding at his feet. But God told him to reach out and take it by the tail. With trembling hands Moses did so, and the serpent became a staff once more. What had always been a simple tool now carried a divine purpose. The desert wind brushed against Moses' face as he held the staff tightly, feeling a new weight within it, symbolic, powerful, and undeniably real. The message was clear. God could transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. What Moses lacked in confidence, God would supply through his presence. The staff in his hand was proof that nothing was impossible for the one who called him. Even with this miracle before him, Moses felt the lingering tremor of fear. The mission ahead seemed insurmountable. Yet God continued to speak, revealing signs and promises that went far beyond human ability. Moses knew then that the life he had built in Midian was ending. His quiet existence would be replaced by a journey filled with danger, conflict, and miracles he could not yet comprehend. As the flames continued to dance without consuming the bush, Moses felt something shift inside him. It was not confidence, not yet, but a spark, a beginning, a realization that the God who called him saw beyond his weaknesses and understood every corner of his heart. And though Moses still felt unworthy, he sensed that the path ahead, however terrifying, was not one he could turn away from. The journey back toward Egypt felt unreal to Moses, as though each step he took carried the weight of a destiny he had never imagined for himself. The desert stretched endlessly behind him, and the memories he had tried so hard to bury rose to the surface with every mile he crossed. Yet despite the fear that tried to cling to him, there was a quiet strength building inside, a strength that wasn't his own, but flowed from the one who had called him. The staff in his hand felt different now, not merely a tool of a shepherd, but a symbol of purpose. When Moses finally approached Egypt, the familiar sights stirred an unsettling mixture of nostalgia and dread within him. The tall structures, the bustling markets, the cries of laborers, all the sounds he had once known, stirred emotions he thought he had long overcome. It did not feel like home, yet it was a land that had shaped him. He knew that stepping foot here again was not just a return, but a confrontation with everything he had once fled. Finding his brother Aaron brought a wave of unexpected relief. Aaron welcomed him with open arms, and together they spoke of the mission God had entrusted to them. Moses felt less alone with Aaron by his side, for his brother's voice would support him where his own faltered. They knew this task would demand both courage and unwavering faith, but there was no turning back. A nation's freedom depended on their obedience. The day Moses and Aaron stood before Pharaoh, the air inside the grand palace felt thick, almost suffocating. The gold-covered walls reflected the torchlight with blinding intensity, and the throne room carried an authority that could crush a man's resolve. Pharaoh sat tall, adorned with symbols of power, his eyes sharp and unyielding. Moses felt the tremor in his hands, but he breathed deeply, remembering the voice that had sent him. When Moses declared the words God had placed in his heart, "Let my people go," his voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of divine authority behind it. Pharaoh's reaction was immediate, a laughter filled with mockery, echoing through the hall like a slap across the face of truth. To him, Moses was nothing more than a runaway shepherd with no influence and no right to speak of freedom. Pharaoh's refusal was expected, yet the hardness in his eyes revealed a pride so deeply rooted that no simple request could shake it. Moses watched as the ruler dismissed him with a wave, confident in his own power and unaware of the storm that was soon to break over his empire. Despite the humiliation Moses felt, he also sensed a growing resolve. This was only the beginning. God instructed Moses to reveal a sign, a demonstration of divine power. Moses cast his staff to the ground, and it transformed into a serpent before the court. Gasps filled the room, but the Pharaoh remained unmoved, signaling for his sorcerers to perform their own illusions. They imitated the miracle, but when Moses' serpent devoured theirs, a hush fell over the crowd. Still, Pharaoh's heart, like iron forged in arrogance, refused to bend. Leaving the palace, Moses felt the first sting of discouragement. He had done exactly what God commanded, yet nothing seemed to change. But God reminded him that Pharaoh's hardened heart was part of a greater plan, one that would reveal divine power in ways Egypt had never witnessed. And so Moses prepared for the next step, knowing that this confrontation would not be won by human persuasion, but by the undeniable hand of God. The first plague struck like a thunderbolt from heaven. Moses stood at the edge of the Nile, lifting his staff over the waters just as God commanded. Within moments, the river bled into a deep, horrifying red. The stench rose quickly, filling the air with decay as fish floated lifeless to the surface. Chaos erupted throughout Egypt as people realized their lifeline, the river that sustained their every need, had become a symbol of judgment. Yet Pharaoh remained unmoved. His pride blinded him, even as his people suffered. Moses saw the devastation with his own eyes. Feeling the heaviness of carrying such a message, he knew each plague brought suffering, yet he could not change the instructions he received. His role was not to question, but to follow, trusting that divine justice was unfolding according to a plan far beyond human understanding. Then came the frogs. They swarmed from every corner of the land, spilling into homes, kitchens, palaces, and beds. Their croaks echoed through the night, driving Egypt into madness. Even then, Pharaoh's heart did not soften. Moses witnessed the cries of the people, the frustration, the desperation, and still he waited for the ruler's heart to shift, even slightly. But the frogs were followed by gnats, and then by swarms of flies so thick that the sky itself seemed darkened. Each plague revealed the weakness of Egypt's idols and the futility of their magic. And with every display of divine authority, Moses' understanding deepened. He was not fighting against a king, but against the spiritual and moral decay of an empire built on oppression. Despite the devastation, Pharaoh hardened his heart again and again. Moses, worn and burdened, sometimes wondered why the change wouldn't come sooner. But each refusal brought a deeper revelation. He was not merely performing signs. He was exposing the hollow foundations of a kingdom built on pride. With every plague, Egypt learned that the God of Israel was not a distant deity, but a living force that no power could rival. Through it all, Moses realized that leadership was not about standing unshaken, but about returning to God, even when doubts clouded his mind. There were nights he lay awake, hearing the distant cries of the Egyptians and the murmurs of his own people who questioned his mission. Yet in those moments, he discovered a deeper courage, the kind that grows not from certainty but from surrender. As the plagues continued, Moses began to understand that this journey was reshaping him as much as it was liberating his people. He had stepped back into Egypt with trembling hands, unsure of his own voice. Now, even as challenges multiplied, he felt a quiet transformation growing within. He was not the man he once was. The fire that had burned without consuming the bush had also begun to burn within his soul, steady, unyielding, and filled with purpose. The night before the final plague settled over Egypt like a trembling hush, as if creation itself held its breath in anticipation. Moses stood among his people, speaking words that felt heavier than any he had spoken before. God had given him instructions unlike any other, instructions that would mark the beginning of a new identity for Israel. Each household was to take a spotless lamb, sacrifice it, and mark their doorposts with its blood. This sign would distinguish the children of Israel from the land steeped in rebellion and pride. Moses felt the weight of what was coming, knowing that this night would change the world forever. Families gathered inside their homes, whispering prayers and holding their children close. The darkness outside felt different, charged with a presence both fearful and divine. Moses walked through the encampment, watching the flickering light through the tent openings. He felt an ache in his heart, not for his own people, but for Egypt, which had hardened itself against countless warnings. This final judgment was not a punishment born out of cruelty, but a response to a heart that refused to bend. And then the moment came. A cry erupted in the night, first a single voice that shattered the silence, then another and another, until the entire land roared with the grief of loss. From the palace draped in gold to the poorest dwelling on the outskirts of the city, The judgment spared no home untouched by the sign. The wails reached the sky, rolling like waves of agony across Egypt. Moses felt tears burn in his eyes as he listened. No human heart could witness such sorrow without trembling. At last Pharaoh summoned Moses. Gone was the arrogance that once wrapped his voice. Now he spoke with the rawness of a broken man. His command was short, almost whispered, yet heavy with surrender. Israel was free to go. Moses felt a rush of emotion, relief, gratitude, and a profound sense of awe. Centuries of slavery were ending in that moment. The people hurried to gather their belongings, carrying with them not only what they owned, but the hope of a freedom they had never experienced. The departure was not silent. It was a mighty movement, thousands upon thousands stepping into the unknown. Mothers carried their children, elders leaned on staffs, and young men guided livestock through the desert path. Moses walked at the front, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and responsibility. Behind him stretched a nation reborn, stepping out of a land that had tried to crush them. The air seemed alive with possibility, but freedom did not erase fear. As the people neared the Red Sea, its vast waters shimmering like a barrier of impossible proportions, uncertainty crept into their hearts. The sea stretched endlessly, and the wilderness hemmed them in on the other side. It was then that the rumbling in the distance began, the unmistakable sound of chariots. Pharaoh had changed his mind. Rage and grief fueled his army, and he was determined to reclaim what he had lost. Panic raced through the people as they saw the dust rising behind them. Children clung to their mothers, and elders murmured in terror. Moses felt the atmosphere tighten, the cries swelling like a storm. Some accused him of leading them to their deaths. Others begged him to find a way out. The feeling of being trapped pressed upon everyone, and even Moses felt the sting of fear trying to claw at his faith. But he could not falter. Not now. He stepped toward the edge of the sea, feeling the cold mist against his skin. The wind whipped through his hair, carrying with it the scent of salt and destiny. Moses lifted his face toward the heavens, seeking the strength that had begun this journey. God had not brought them this far to abandon them here. With the staff, once a simple shepherd's tool, firm in his hand, he stretched his arm over the water and waited. What happened next was beyond comprehension. A wind surged through the night, powerful and unrelenting. The waters trembled, then began to shift as though pulled by invisible hands. Waves curled upward, rising like towering walls on both sides, while the exposed seabed stretched forward like a passage carved from the impossible. Light flickered within the parted waters, reflecting the power that held them at bay. The sea had become a doorway into hope. A hush fell over the people as they stared at the miracle before them. The fear that had consumed them moments earlier turned into awe. Moses took the first step onto the seabed, and the nation followed. Their footsteps echoed through the corridor of water, each step a declaration of trust. Children reached out to touch the shimmering walls of water, their faces glowing with wonder. What once threatened to swallow them had become their deliverance. Behind them, the Egyptians pressed forward, disbelief turning to determination. Pharaoh's army surged onto the same path, the roar of chariot wheels echoing like thunder. Moses urged the people forward, knowing that time was slipping away. The air felt charged as though the breath of heaven itself was holding the waters back. The Israelites pushed through the final stretch, the sound of their hurried footsteps mixing with the pounding chase behind them. As the last of the Israelites reached safety on the opposite shore, Moses turned back. His heart, once trembling with fear, now pulsed with unwavering conviction. He lifted the staff once more, following the divine instruction that whispered within his spirit. The walls of water trembled, then collapsed with a force that shook the earth. The sea roared back into place, swallowing the Egyptian army in a single, thunderous sweep. Silence fell. The only sound was the crash of waves settling back into their eternal rhythm. The people stood frozen, watching the water calm as though nothing had ever happened. Tears filled their eyes, not only from relief but from witnessing a deliverance so profound it reshaped their understanding of who God truly was. The danger was gone. The impossible had been conquered. A song of freedom rose among them, voices trembling with gratitude. Moses felt the emotion rise within him, overwhelming and humbling. This moment was not about him. It was about the faithfulness of the one who had guided them through every impossible step. The desert ahead was still unknown, but the people now carried a story that would strengthen them for generations. They had walked through the sea, through the very heart of a miracle. That night, as the people rested along the shore, Moses gazed at the stars stretched across the sky. The journey wasn't over, not even close. Hardships lay ahead: hunger, thirst, doubts, and the shaping of a nation that had known nothing but slavery. But Moses felt something new growing inside him, a courage forged not in confidence but in surrender. The God who parted the sea would lead them through every wilderness. And so, with the wind brushing softly against him, Moses closed his eyes and breathed deeply. Freedom had begun, and the desert was waiting. The first days in the wilderness were filled with a strange mixture of wonder and exhaustion. The people of Israel had witnessed miracles beyond imagination, yet the desert stretched before them like an endless sea of heat and uncertainty. The memory of the parted waters still clung to their minds, but hunger and fatigue began to whisper doubts into their hearts. Moses felt the weight of thousands of eyes turning to him for answers he did not possess. He was not a king, not a warrior, not a man trained to lead nations. He was a shepherd who had been given a mission far greater than his own strength. As complaints began to rise among the people, Moses felt their despair, like sharp fragments settling in his chest. They remembered Egypt not as a prison, but as a place where food had been available, where water had been near. Fear distorted their memories, and the road ahead seemed unbearable. Moses heard their cries and carried them to God, pouring out his own frustrations along with theirs. He had no solutions, only a willingness to listen and obey whatever instructions God provided. God answered with mercy that defied human understanding. One morning, as the sun painted the sky with soft shades of gold, the people stepped out of their tents and found the ground covered in something strange, thin white flakes scattered like dew that had turned to bread. They stared at it in confusion, unsure whether to fear it or gather it. Moses approached them calmly and explained that this was God's provision, a heavenly bread meant to sustain them through the wilderness. The people tasted it, and astonishment spread across their faces. It was unlike anything they had ever eaten, nourishing, sweet, pure, and it fell again the next morning, and the next, as faithful as the sunrise. Yet even with food in their hands, doubt still found places to grow. The heat of the desert drained their strength, and water became scarcer with every passing day. The tension grew thick, and frustration boiled over. Moses once again stood at the center of their complaints, feeling their desperation vibrate through him. He had no reservoir, no spring hidden beneath the earth, only a staff worn by the touch of his hands and the memory of the God who had never failed them. In that moment of overwhelming turmoil, God gave Moses a new command. It made no sense by human logic, yet Moses had learned that obedience often opened doors where impossibility once stood. He was to strike a rock, a simple, lifeless stone in the midst of barren land. With a heart heavy but full of trust, Moses lifted his staff and struck. The moment the staff met the stone, a crack echoed through the air, followed by an eruption of rushing water that poured forth with unstoppable force. The people gasped, running toward the stream that spilled across the desert floor. Hope, once fading, now surged like a river. As the journey continued, the people began to realize they were not just traveling, but being transformed. Their former identity as slaves was shedding, slowly replaced by the shaping of a nation meant to walk with God. Still, the process was painful. They battled not only the harshness of the environment, but the harshness of their own hearts: fear, doubt, impatience. At every turn, Moses remained the bridge between their cries and God's voice, listening, interceding, pleading for mercy when judgment threatened to descend. The day they reached the foot of a towering mountain, cloaked in thick clouds, something inside Moses stirred. This mountain, Mount Sinai, radiated a presence that felt ancient and sacred. Thunder rolled across the sky and lightning streaked through the clouds as if heaven itself leaned close to speak. God summoned Moses to climb, and even though the mountain trembled with holy fire, Moses stepped forward with trembling but willing steps. He ascended alone, leaving behind the murmuring of the people below. On the mountain, Moses encountered the presence of God in a way he had never known. Smoke curled around him, the air trembling with divine power. It was there that God gave him not only instructions, but a covenant, a set of laws that would serve as the foundation for a nation called to walk differently from the world around them. The 10 Commandments were more than rules. They were a blueprint for freedom, a guide for living with reverence, justice, and compassion. Moses received the tablets with hands that shook under the weight of what they represented. But when Moses descended the mountain, carrying the stone tablets carved by the very finger of God, his heart shattered at the sight before him. The people he had labored for, prayed for, defended, and guided had fallen into rebellion. In his absence, they had crafted a golden calf, worshipping it as though it were the source of their deliverance. Moses felt a storm surge inside him, grief, anger, disappointment, all crashing together. It was not the tablets that broke first, but his heart, and then the stone followed, shattering on the ground, as the echoes of betrayal filled the air. Though the betrayal cut deeply, Moses did not abandon the people. Instead, he returned to God on their behalf, pleading for forgiveness with a desperation born from love and loyalty. He stood between divine justice and human weakness, not because he was perfect, but because he understood that these people, flawed as they were the very ones God had chosen. His intercession became an act of breathtaking courage, a testament to the transformation inside him. Over time, the nation began to find its rhythm, learning, slowly, painfully, to trust the God who had rescued them. Moses continued to guide them with humility, understanding that leadership was not about authority, but sacrifice. He spent hours in God's presence, returning with a face that glowed with reflected glory. The people watched him and learned that communion with God was not a ritual, but a relationship that shaped every step of their journey. Yet Moses knew his own journey would not end in the land he had long promised to the people. He felt it in the quiet moments, a whisper in his spirit that his role was to guide, not to enter. And when the day came that God led him to the top of Mount Nebo, Moses stood upon the heights and saw the promised land stretching wide beneath him. It was beautiful, lush, green, full of life, a land flowing with abundance. Moses felt tears gather in his eyes, not of sorrow, but of fulfillment. He had not reached the land himself, but he had carried a nation to its threshold. This, he realized, was his purpose, not to receive the promise, but to prepare others for it. The wind brushed softly against his face, as if heaven itself acknowledged his journey. He breathed deeply, his heart at peace. The God who had called him from a burning bush had been faithful through every desert, every doubt, every moment of weakness. As Moses closed his eyes for the final time, there was no fear, only a profound sense of completion. His story did not end in the promised land, but in the arms of the one who had walked with him every step, and his legacy lived on in the hearts of generations who would speak his name, not as a man of perfection, but as a man of faith, a man who dared to step into the impossible because God whispered his name.